Jewish people have a tendency to seek meaning in things and in events, even if those things or events are not specifically Jewish. As we know, this coming week, the whole United States of America is going to be celebrating Thanksgiving. So I thought I would just bring some kind of Jewish thought into the idea of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is not just a family time, which for many people it is. Certainly not just a time for eating and preparing the food and the shopping and all of that. But it's also a time for people to seriously reflect upon the bounty that this country has given to all of us. And in thinking about that, I wanted to hearken back to the very first Thanksgiving and what the origin was of this festival that is so widely celebrated here in this country. And the first Thanksgiving, as many of you most likely know, was celebrated by the Pilgrims in 1621 after a year of very, very serious suffering. They had come the year before, they suffered through a terrible winter. They came with about 100 people, settled in near the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They actually settled in Plymouth Plantation. And over the course of the first year, they lost half of their members. 100 people came, 50 survived. It was terrible suffering. But as we would say, as Hashem would have it, a rather highly unusual event occurred. We would actually call it miraculous. They didn't call it miraculous, but they certainly called it providential, and that was the following: that a certain individual, a Native American, walked out of the wilderness speaking English to them. His name was Squanto, and his story was that he had previously been taken captive and prisoner by Spaniards who had come earlier, taken to Spain, then freed in Spain, traveled to England, lived in England for a while, learned English, and then decided to rejoin his tribe in America, and came back only to find, to his loss, that his entire people had died out in some kind of a plague. They think it was smallpox, but nobody's really sure what it was, but he was left with nothing. And so he's living by himself in the wilderness, and then he walks out of the wilderness to meet this group of English-speaking people, the Pilgrims. And so, of course, he helps them. First of all, he helps them to settle and to plant and to harvest, but he also helps them to negotiate with the other Native Americans who were there. And when they decide to have this harvest feast, which might have coincided with other holidays, there may have been Christian holidays, that not quite clear why they had this first Thanksgiving. Some want to theorize that they actually knew about the Jewish festival of Sukkot, which was a harvest festival of some kind, and that they wanted to have it coincide with Sukkot also. But be that as it may, whatever it was, they had some kind of Thanksgiving festival after a great deal of suffering, and after this highly unusual and unlikely event of this gentleman Squanto showing up and helping them to survive in the New World. That was the first Thanksgiving. And of course, much later it became a national holiday here. I want to make 2 points about this. One is that the salvation that came, the help that came, and the bounty that came to them came after a great deal of suffering. That's very, very important. And the second is that they recognized that, and that they set up a Thanksgiving festival to express their thanks to God. That's Thanksgiving. I want to talk about another holiday that's coming up, and that's the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Coming up in a couple of weeks, and just very briefly, I think most everybody here knows the basic outline of the Hanukkah story. It happened about 2,000 years ago, approximately the year 165 before the Common Era, BCE, when the Greek Syrians occupied the land of Israel. They occupied the city of Jerusalem, issued some terrible decrees to the Jews, made the Jews suffer a great deal. The decrees included no study of Torah, no keeping of Shabbos, no keeping of the circumcision of bris milah, among others. So these are really very foundational things. And what they really wanted was that the Jewish people would assimilate into the Greek culture that had pervaded the entire world as a result of Alexander the Great having come and spread Greek culture all over the Middle East and as far as Persia. And after Alexander had died, his kingdom had been split up, and the Syrian Greeks had controlled this part of the Middle East. And now many Jews, unfortunately, succumbed, and we call them misyavnim. They had assimilated into Greek culture, but there were many who fought the Greek culture and retained their Jewish identities and studied the Torah and kept the mitzvos. There was a revolt led by a small group, a small family called the Hashmonaim, who established later what's known today in historical terms as the Hasmonean kingdoms, lasted quite some time. And the small family, they were called Maccabim, and they began a revolt against the Syrian Greeks. And against all odds, there were 13 people who began this revolt, and they got others to join them. But of course, they were untrained in the art of warfare. They had really no military training whatsoever, certainly no arms, and they were going up against a very large, well-trained, well-armed Greek army. But they had the bitachon, the security in Hashem, that Hashem was going to protect them and help them and enable them to succeed, and they did succeed. And they were able to overcome the Syrian Greeks. They were able to take back the Beis HaMikdash. The Syrian Greeks had already installed an idol in the Holy Temple, in the Second Temple. They were able to destroy that idol. They were able to rebuild the altar that had been defiled. And of course, they found, this is the well-known miracle, that they found the jug of oil, which was only going to last for one night or one day, and it lasted for the 8 days until they were able to make new oil and relight and rekindle the menorah. And as a result, they established the holiday of Hanukkah so that we would remember the great miracles that occurred. But the truth of the matter is that it wasn't only to remember, because as we have in our Al Hanisim tefillah, in our Al Hanisim prayer, the very end it says, they established these 8 days of Hanukkah, lahodos ulahalel l'shimcha hagadol. Lahodos means to give thanks and to praise Hashem's great name for all of the miracles that He had brought upon them. And so that Hanukkah is also a time of thanksgiving. It's a time of lahodos. It's a time, and in fact, the prayer, when we insert it in our davening, in our Shemona Esrei, it's in the modim prayer, when we bow and we thank God for all of the goodness, for the life that He has given us. Even in our benching, it's in the Al Hanisim prayer is inserted in No Delacha, in the blessing in which we thank Hashem, we thank God for all of the good things that He has given to us. So that I think we have a common denominator between the secular holiday, the American holiday of Thanksgiving, and our very particularistic Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. In that there was a period of suffering that occurred, there were prayers, there was a turning to God, there was a salvation that occurred, and then there was an acknowledgement and a thanking God that the salvation had occurred. So that we have kind of a common shared value between these two holidays, the secular Thanksgiving on the one hand, and of course our religious Hanukkah on the other. And so with that, I think we can take that home, and that thought home, that everything that we have, whether we experience something as not so good or as suffering, which of course does deepen us, not that we look for suffering, but if chas v'shalom, if there is suffering, it does deepen us, it enables us to turn to Hashem and to beseech Him and to ask Him to remove that suffering. And then when it is removed and when we have the salvation that we're seeking, then we thank Hashem for that. And this is the quality of the Jew. The Jew is always thankful to Hashem for whatever it is that he bestows upon us. And so with that, I want to wish everybody a happy and meaningful Thanksgiving and a very happy and meaningful Hanukkah.